Chapter 11, A Reunion in the Tower. From the first car leaped Jacob Sydney. Looking neither to right nor to left, he sprinted for the porch. Peter Bonton jumped from the second machine and likewise dashed for the piazza steps where Nancy was sitting. The girl was no slower than either of the men. She leaped to her feet and pretended to stumble, leaning against the door for support. Bonton and his estranged cousin, panting heavily, drew up side by side in front of her. "Stand aside and see that no one follows me," Jacob Sydney commanded. "Let me in. I am in a hurry to see Mr. Sydney on a confidential matter," Bonton puffed. "He is busy just now," Nancy said. "He is in conference and does not wish to be disturbed. Won't you sit down?" "With whom is he conferring?" Bonton cried. "I am not at liberty to discuss that," Nancy replied sweetly. "Won't you two gentlemen have some iced tea?" "Two gentlemen?" Jacob Sydney sneered. "I can account for only one here." "Thank you for the compliment, Sydney," Bonton retorted. "I am glad you admit you are no gentleman." "Don't speak to me, you weasel, you," Sydney fumed. "I'll have you understand that you and I are not on speaking terms." "I'll bring you both pencil and paper," Nancy suggested, still not budging from the door. "You might write each other notes if you won't talk." "Say, who are you, anyhow?" Bonton demanded. "Why, Mr. Bonton, we were introduced last night," Nancy replied. "Bess and George were here with me. Don't you remember?" "You won't be here with Bess and George again, here nor anywhere else," Bonton roared. "I remember you now," Sydney exclaimed. "You were sitting in a car right out there in the driveway. Say, what is your business around here?" "I am a chauffeur," Nancy said. "Or is a lady chauffeur a chauffess? What would you say, Mr. Bonton?" "Why, I would say a chauffeuress," Bonton replied. "No, the French way would be chauffeuse," Sydney interjected. "It is a French word." "Really?" Nancy asked, wide-eyed. "Isn't that odd? What does it mean?" "Why, it means—" "See here," Sydney yelled, stamping his foot. "You are just trying to keep me with your fool questions from going upstairs. I can see through your tricks." Nancy heard a commotion in the hall behind her and wondered for a moment if she were to be attacked from the rear as well. The clanking and swishing soon stopped, however, and she once more turned her attention to the two men who were now in violent debate. "I'll go up first because I'm his blood relative and bear his name," Sydney shouted. "I have as much right to see him as you have," Bonton argued. "I was here first," Sydney snapped. "I got to the door ahead of you, didn't I, miss?" Bonton appealed to Nancy. "Why don't you toss for it?" Nancy suggested. "Has either of you a quarter?" Bonton started to dig in his trouser pocket for a coin when Sydney suddenly pushed Nancy aside and jerked open the door. With a strangled cry, Bonton caught his cousin by the coat, and the two men leaped into the hallway together, Nancy at their heels. A new obstacle confronted them, however, and Nancy felt like giving 3 cheers to Sadie, who had acted with quick-wittedness to help the situation. Across the bottom steps of the stairs, she had stretched a broom and a mop. Many of the treads were dripping soapy water, and halfway up knelt Sadie, surrounded by 3 buckets of water. She was swinging a scrubbing brush. "Hey, let us up!" Bonton shouted. Sadie gave a start and upset one pail. The men leaped to one side, just as a cascade of dirty water splashed down upon the spot where they had been standing. "Oh, you scared me!" Sadie cried. "Wait, and I'll mop the water so you can come up without slipping." While the two fortune hunters fairly danced with impatience, Sadie carried down one pail of water, then climbed the stairs again and carried another to the top. Then slowly she wiped away the excess water. Her skirts were soaked and her hands were red, but for all that, Sadie seemed to be enjoying herself. She picked up the broom and the mop, and then the two men made a rush for the stairs. Of course, they jammed together, clawing at each other for a moment. Nancy and Sadie, their arms entwined, could not avoid the gales of laughter which the absurd battle provoked in them. At last, Bonton gained the advantage and darted upward, Sydney only a step behind. "That was splendid work, Sadie, splendid," Nancy whispered. It gave Mr. Sydney and Dad another 5 minutes of precious time. That was a real stroke of genius, getting those pails and mops and then upsetting the water. Sadie glowed with pride at the praise. She was not accustomed to it, and the words left her blushing and speechless. With a parting pat on the back, Nancy left Sadie and darted upstairs after the two men. She caught up with them just as they burst into the door of the tower room. "In the name of the law, I demand that you stop," Peter Bonton shouted as he threw open the door. "Don't pay any attention to him," Jacob Sydney yelled. "But stop whatever you are doing." Nancy saw ASA Sydney leaning back in his favorite chair near the great, ever-burning twisted candle. Standing at a small nearby table with his back turned, but staring calmly over his shoulder at the intruders, was her father, Carson Drew. At the table, with pen in hand, as if he had just finished writing, Raymond Hill was seated. A number of sheets of paper covered with writing were in view. "What branch of the law do you represent?" Mr. Drew asked Bonton quietly, gathering up the papers and folding them lengthwise. "Are you a policeman, a sheriff, a marshal, or a constable?" he continued. "Speak up." Nonplussed, Bonton stood stock still, his mouth opening and closing like a goldfish's. I'm not an officer," he said finally. "But hasn't a relative any rights in a case like this?" "A case like what?" Mr. Drew asked. "I have just finished drawing up Mr. Sydney's will, which Mr. Hill here has witnessed. Is there anything illegal about that?" "I demand to see the document," Jacob Sydney announced, striding forward. "I suspect that you have put some ideas into my kinsman's head." That remark angered Nancy, for she knew her father's code of justice was rigid and unyielding. Her blue eyes flashing, she strode forward and faced the speaker. "I resent that remark, Mr. Sydney," she cried with a toss of her blonde head. "This is the first time my father has seen Mr. Sydney, and before last night he did not even know of his existence. I demand that you apologize." Bonton and Sydney retreated a step before the girl's onslaught. Who are you anyhow?" Jacob asked uncertainly. "Everybody seems to be running this show except those who are most interested." With a deep-throated chuckle, ASA Sydney arose from his chair and entered the circle of disputants. "It is more than passing strange," he said in his quaint, old-fashioned, stilted English, "that I should have been left alone and unprotected all these years, and now suddenly you become so deeply concerned over me and so worried about my affairs. I assure you, my nephews, that I am just as able to care for myself today as I was a year ago." "I don't doubt it, Uncle Asa," Jacob said in mollifying tones. "I not only think you are able to care for yourself, but you are the first person I should wish to consult in any transaction. I just want to warn you against putting too much confidence in utter strangers." "And not only utter strangers, but scheming relatives," Peter Bonton interjected. "You know I have only your best interests at heart." Just the same, a stranger may prove to be a great friend, Nancy murmured. Asa overheard her remark and burst into a chuckle. He clapped Nancy on the shoulder, finally letting his arm rest there affectionately. "You should take your daughter into partnership, Mr. Drew," he said. "I think she would be an asset to any firm." "She is my silent partner," the lawyer smiled, "yet a most active one. I frequently consult Nancy, and her advice is always good." "She reminds me very much of my Jenny," Asa said sadly. "That makes me even more fond of her." Bonton and Jacob Sydney listened to this conversation with deepening frowns. "I hope, Uncle Asa, that you are not permitting a chance likeness to unduly influence you," Jacob said. "When I need your advice, I shall consult you," Asa said rather testily. "And I faintly suspect that I shall live another 100 years before that becomes necessary." "I was only trying to help you," Jacob muttered. "Oh, do you really wish to be of service to me?" Asa asked, a twinkle appearing in his eyes. "Yes, indeed," Jacob replied eagerly, eager to ingratiate himself with the old man. "Let me do it," Peter shouted, thrusting himself forward. Nancy could not help likening the actions of the men to those of scheming little boys, although each was almost old enough to be her grandfather. "Well, you may both do it," Asa said, stroking his long beard judiciously. What shall we do?" chorused the nephews. "Get out!" Asa thundered in a tone that surprised everyone. "Get out of here and stay out until I ask you to come back. You have sickened me, both of you. You think I have money and are fluttering around like a pair of vultures waiting for me to die. Go!" Peter and Jacob paled at being shown up like this before the lawyer, the banker, and, most of all, before a mere slip of a girl. Nancy felt Asa's hand tremble as it rested on her shoulder, and the old man's breath wheezed in his throat. He swayed on his feet and clung for a moment to the girl's arm to steady himself. The two grasping nephews backed slowly toward the door. Nancy feared that another outburst from old Asa would seriously sap his feeble strength, so she slipped toward the door to speed the departure of Peter and Jacob. Those two worthies, however, had grown desperate at the thought of losing the inheritance. Normally, both were respectable and respected men, honest and industrious. Yet visions of an unearned fortune had somehow appealed to their baser natures. They were not going to let it slip by them without a struggle. "Please be calm and reasonable," Peter began in a low, soothing tone. "I was impetuous, and I beg you to bear me no ill will, Uncle." Asa wearily signaled to Nancy to open the door. She grasped the knob and swung the portal wide. "Oh, I dropped something. There, blushing and stuttering, revealed for everyone to see in his chagrin, crouched Frank Semmet on the doorstep. He had had his ear to the keyhole. He had been eavesdropping. End of chapter 11.